The exchange variation in the Queen's Gambit declined involves an early exchange on d5 initiated by white. So for example, in this position, white may play c takes d5 and then e takes d5. And this is known as the exchange variation. You may wonder, why does white make this move? Because he just allowed black to remove his e6 pawn and open up the diagonal for his once bad bishop. Well, there are several reasons for this exchange. One reason is white does get a half-open file for his rook. Another reason is white has made the pawn break c5 that black usually enjoys in the Queen's Gambit declined not so palatable because it saddles him with an isolated d-pawn. And another reason is white gets something called a minority attack on the queen side. Okay, black has a majority of pawns on the queen side, and very often white starts to attack them by pushing his pawns. And I'm just going to make some silly moves by black here to illustrate. White would like to push his b pawn here and then exchange it off for black's c pawn. And doing that gives black a backward pawn which can become a target for white's pieces, especially a rook from c1. Also, black has an isolated a pawn to attack as well. So white gets this minority attack. Okay, another issue to discuss in the exchange variation is sometimes it's played with a knight on f3 and sometimes it's played with a knight on e2. Putting the knight on e2 gives white the additional option of playing f3 and e4, expanding in the center. Okay. Sometimes white's knight ends up on f3, however. From f3, it can participate in attacking a weakened c6 pawn from e5 after the minority attack has taken place. Okay, so it can be played with the knight in either position. Sometimes black doesn't want to play the exchange variation with a knight on e2. He wants to force white to play his knight to f3, and he can do this through a cunning move order. Sometimes you notice the black player gets into a Queen's Gambit declined by playing knight to f6 on the first move, and then after c4 playing e6. Now the point of this move order is to try to induce white to play his knight to f3 right here. If white wants to keep that knight back and reserve the option of playing it to e2 later, then he'd play knight to c3 here. But that gives black the strong option of playing the Nimzo-Indian defense, bishop to b4. And if black is prepared to play that, then he can avoid all the Queen's Gambit exchange lines with a knight on e2. Instead of allowing the Nimzo-Indian, many players as white would play knight to f3 here. After knight to f3, then black can get into the Queen's Gambit declined with this knight already committed on f3. The exchange variation can still take place, but black has avoided it in the case of having the knight on e2. All right, let's look at some specific games. Okay, I'm going to look at the beginning, the opening phase of a grandmaster game here. It started d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3 avoiding the Nimzo, d5. Now we're into a Queen's Gambit declined, knight c3, bishop e7, and now white exchanges on d5. So we're in an exchange variation, and black has just opened the diagonal for his bishop. So one of black's goals in this line is to get his bishop to f5, to activate it. Okay? And white tries to prevent that. White begins with bishop g5, reasoning that black cannot play bishop to f5 yet, or he loses a pawn, by the move bishop takes f6, queen to b3, forking these two pawns. So black will go down a pawn. So he takes the time here to play bishop to g5 to get his bishop outside of the pawn chain. And now black would like to prepare the move bishop to f5, and he does so by playing c6, guarding that weak d5 pawn. So a move like queen to b3 would no longer be a fork. So now he really is threatening to move his bishop to f5, and a typical move here by white is to play queen to c2 to beat him to that diagonal. So he's stopping the move bishop to f5. Well, black desperately wants to play it, so he moves g6 in this position, okay, to support his bishop on f5. This does weaken the dark squares around the black king, though, and his bishop has already committed itself to e7, so it's not on g7 protecting these dark squares. Okay, nevertheless, black can get away with this, and white desperately tries to stop the bishop from coming to f5 by playing e4. Okay, and this allows black to give white an isolated d-pawn, which is what occurred in the game. Now after this check, black could play the reasonable looking queen to e7, but he decides to sidestep the check with his king and head for the g7 square. Then bishop c4, nice developing move, king to g7, castles, rook to e8, attacking the queen, it steps aside, and finally black gets his so-called bad bishop out. Okay, it's no longer bad though. All right, we're going to stop the game there. I just wanted to introduce you to some of the ideas in this opening, and let's look at one more game. This is another grandmaster game. Okay, this one begins with d4, d5. Okay, then c4, c6 is known as the Slav defense. There are many transpositions possible in these queen's pawn openings. Then knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, and now e6, this is known as the semi-Slav defense when black has this little triangle of pawns. If you look at these four pawns, you can see the structure of the Queen's Gambit declined, though. So it's just like a Queen's Gambit declined with this pawn already moved to c6. Bishop g5. And now black could play bishop to e7 here, but he plays knight b d7. This signals an intent to play the Cambridge Springs defense with the move queen to a5. And we can get into the main line by playing e3, queen a5. And this is an entirely different opening called the Cambridge Springs defense. And there's a lot of interesting ideas in it. But sometimes white doesn't want to play the Cambridge Springs. So as soon as he sees this move, knight b d7, he can avoid it. It's possible for white to always avoid the Cambridge Springs if he doesn't want to play it, by instead exchanging on d5. And then after black takes back with this e-pawn, we've now transposed into the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. So we went from a Slav to a semi-Slav to potential Cambridge Springs to the exchange variation. Okay, and this is another case where the knight has already committed itself to f3. Okay, so white plays e3 in this position, and black plays bishop e7, getting ready to castle. Bishop d3, white wants to control this diagonal. Remember, he doesn't want this bishop showing up on f5. Castles, queen to c2. It's a great square for the queen in the exchange variation. Not only does it control this diagonal, but it also puts pressure down the c-file. Then rook e8, castles, and now black is going to embark on a lengthy plan to get his light squared bishop to f5. The way he's going to do it is he just made room on f8 by sliding his rook over. He's going to maneuver this knight to f8, then to e6, after that pawn has been pushed to g6, and then he's going to nestle his knight on the g7 square. You can call that fianchettoing the knight. From g7 it supports the move bishop to f5. So that is Black's plan. Now while he carries out that plan, let's watch White effect the minority attack on the queen side. Okay, let's see what happens. So knight f8, rook a b1. This supports the pawn push b2 to b4 because b4 is currently guarded by Black. g6. Okay, notice he can't move here yet and then play g6 because he loses the h7 pawn after this exchange. Okay. So first he plays g6 before putting the knight on e6 to block the attack on h7. So now b4 continuing on with the minority attack. Knight e6, which does hit this bishop on g5, so it falls back to h4. a6 is an attempt to slow down the minority attack here, but White just presses ahead with a4 to further support this push. Knight to g7, just as planned. b5, attacking. A takes b5, a takes b5, and then bishop f5 as planned. So finally Black gets his bishop out and into the game and offers a trade. So his bad bishop is going to be gone soon. Then White follows through with his plan of taking on c6 to give Black this backward c pawn that he can attack. Okay. Then knight e5 further puts pressure on that pawn, and Black has to guard it. He slides his rook over, rook to b7, excellent post on the 7th rank, queen d6, knight a4, threatening to come in here to b6 or controlling the c5 square. Black trades the bishops. Black gets the knight to e4 to offer a further trade. Often Black is trying to trade pieces to relieve his position. Rooks get exchanged, and we're going to stop right here. This game did end up as a draw, as did the last game. Okay, so I hope you saw some of the plans and ideas in the exchange variation. Thanks for watching the video.